You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, historian author James M. Scott. We are discussing his book. It's just such a really terrific treatment of not only the time period, but the personalities. His book, Empire of Ashes, Truman, Hirohito, and the Descent into Total War. Mr. Scott, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
You don't see Truman and Hirohito, they're not exactly Astaire and Rogers. You don't see them paired very often. Why did you choose? We like subtitles at the Leaders and Legends podcast. We ask all of our authors about them. Why did you choose this particular subtitle?
Well, because they're at the heart of the book, and I'm with you. Subtitles are very difficult to write, and it's amazing. Your listeners might appreciate the difficulties that go into titling books, particularly in an era of Google algorithms and search engine optimization. But there really is kind of an art form to it, in that what you're trying to communicate to a reader, and which is not only is it part of the story, but it's the names and things like that help people connect to an era or particularly a piece, time, and place in history. But for this one, it was actually pretty easy in that these two figures are essentially at the heart of the book. And it's Empire of Ashes, and kind of like its name implies, it's looking at sort of the fiery destruction of Japan. And it's not just the atomic bombs. It also looks at the fire rays that preceded the atomic bombs, which a lot of people don't remember as well. They often get overshadowed by the atomic bombs, but it's the incendiary campaign that sort of leads up to them that destroys many of Japan's major industrial cities and smaller cities as well. And it's sort of throughout that last pivotal 125 days, the end of this war, and the prevention of an even greater catastrophe through an invasion of the Japanese homeland is really going to rest upon the shoulders of these two very unlikely leaders. In the United States, we have Harry Truman, who ascends to the presidency after the death of FDR on April 12th. He is very much an unknown figure to a lot of people in the American public at that point. One of my favorite lines actually comes from Admiral Leahy, who is the de facto chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. When he learns that Harry Truman is actually going to join FDR on that final ticket in 1944, he remarks, "Who the hell is Harry Truman?" I think that statement kind of sums up. If Leahy didn't know in the fall of 1944, you can imagine your average American was equally as dumbfounded by this figure when they wake up on the morning of the 13th and reading the headlines that he's now president. He's a largely unknown figure, and to him is going to fall this gargantuan task of sort of steering the United States through the end of the war, and securing the peace. And his counterpart on the flip side is Emperor Hirohito, who is a very well-known figure in Japan. He's the sort of center of cultural, political, and spiritual life, but he's pretty much a passive bystander through a lot of the war because of the complexities of Japanese culture and, of course, the threat of political assassination. And it's really going to be in 1945 when he starts seeing his cities being destroyed or whatnot that Hirohito is going to, like Truman, have to rise to the occasion and help steer his country to surrender before an even greater catastrophe, in this case, the collision between the Japanese and American armies in a battle for the homeland. And so really, you have these two figures on whose shoulders rests the fate of millions of people in the destinies of two countries. And so it just kind of worked out perfectly that way.
I want to get to the greater catastrophe point here in just a second, because I really think in some ways that's the heart of your book. Besides the personalities, it's the avoidance. We used horror to avoid an even greater horror, in my view. And I think that comes through in your book. But quickly, did Truman and Emperor Hirohito, President Truman, did they have anything in common? Is there any way, you do a lot of these, there was what Alan Bullock wrote Parallel Lives between about Stalin and Hitler, but is there any sense that they could have understood each other and where each other was coming from?
Well, yeah, I think they could have in the fact that Hirohito is a closet historian at heart, and people forget that he was a big fan of Abraham Lincoln. In fact, he was widely read in history. I mean, his personal interests often tended to steer more toward marine biology and poetry and whatnot, but he was an avid fan of history. So too was Truman. Truman was a voracious reader of history, and that's actually one of the things I think that really saves Truman. He spends a lot of his adolescence and youth because he's not a sportsy kind of guy at all. He wore glasses, which,
Can't
were
see, he's
can't
tiny.
see. He plays the piano. He's not an athlete, but he loves history, and so he's devouring biographies of Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan, and he's studying military history and whatnot. And on the flip side of that, you have Hirohito, who likewise has a pretty isolated adolescence. In this case, he's cut off not only from his family in part, but also the larger Japan. So he too becomes sort of a study in a lot of ways. And American history is one of the areas that he finds very interesting. And so he studies everything from Charles Darwin to Abraham Lincoln. So I think the two would have shared the overlap and appreciation and love of history.
It's somewhat easy for us to picture how Truman got to prominence in politics, right? He was a county judge and eventually he made his way up to senator, and he was tied to a relatively corrupt not relatively. Let's start all over.
Work
To
right.
a significantly a corrupt political machine in Missouri, although Truman was never really associated with any of that. He gets chosen to be vice president in the 1944 Democratic National Convention because the people who run the party clearly understand that Franklin Roosevelt isn't going to make it through a fourth term. He was that sick at that point. And they dump Henry Wallace and install this Harry Truman guy. And then he becomes president April 12th, 1945, when Roosevelt dies down in Warm Springs. As an American civics person or people who listen to the podcast, that all makes sense. But please take a minute or two and explain Hirohito's status and situation in Japan because it could not be more different.
No, it couldn't. And Hirohito, the emperor is I noted earlier, sort of the center of political, spiritual, cultural, and in theory, military life in Japan. But he's really a figurehead more than anything. The population worships him as a god. The military is going to do everything in his name. And even though in theory he has to preside and pass judgment over the outbreak of World War II, he has to give his blessing for the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's He's not a very strong figure in any way, shape, or form. And part of that has to do with the transformation that's happened in Japanese society in the lead up to the outbreak of World War II. And what you see is a massive consolidation of power in the hands of Japanese militarists. And not only are they sort of consolidating political power, but they also spend a lot of time sort of destroying those guardrails in a free society that might have challenged that power. They go after the media, they force the closure of the majority of Japanese newspapers, create a propaganda arm in the form of Demai, the wire service there, their equivalent of the Associated Press, but it's run largely by the military and the government. They go after academics. They go after trade unions. They change the curriculum in schools. So they really spend a lot of time sort of reshaping Japanese society. One of the tools that they use, and it's very common in Japanese society, is political assassination. Political violence is super common in Japan, so much so that Admiral Yamamoto, who's the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and was often outspoken. I mean, he was constantly under the threat. His aides would often sleep with weapons because they were convinced somebody's going to break in the middle of the night and try to shoot him. And of course, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, who is Hirohito's prime minister at the end of the war, likewise barely survived an assassination in the 1930s. I mean, he still carried a bullet inside him at the time of this final negotiation. So everything Hirohito does is done with this sort of threat of this cloud hanging over him. And he also recognizes that he's got siblings and that though he is emperor, he could also be killed and one of his siblings sort of fleed up to that role. And so there's very much a delicate dance that has to take place between the emperor and his military there. And of course, even though Japan has a cabinet, it's about 24 members, your finance member, your foreign minister and whatnot, it is largely really controlled by a group called the Big Six. And this is a war council, supreme war council that effectively controls everything politically in Japan. And those six men, it's the foreign minister, the prime minister, the navy minister, the war minister, and the chiefs of staffs of the army and the navy. They control everything. And Hirohito technically presides over that, but they make the decisions, and he really just sort of passively nods along with what they do, of course, until the very, very end of the war when that's going to change. But Hirohito is not a dominant, powerful figure like we think of for somebody like this. I mean, he is not Alexander the Great. He is not Julius Caesar. He is not Napoleon. At the end of the day, he is sort of a weak figure. He's got stooped shoulders. He's slender. He's got a high-pitched voice. He talks to himself when he gets really nervous. I mean, he looks better suited to being in a library than a war room by any stretch.
More akin to Kaiser Wilhelm.
Yeah. Yeah. So he's not, yeah, exactly.
The march to war in the Pacific, it starts way before December 7th, 1941. The Japanese are in China. There's a significant amount of tension between the United States and Japan. There was sort of this, like there often is in the lead up to war, this sense of inevitability. It's going to happen. Let's do it on our terms, speaking from the Japanese point of view. Where was Emperor Hirohito in all this during this time? And you mentioned he was a student of history. He had to have known. Was it Edward Grey, the British foreign minister, that the United States is like a gigantic boiler. Once lit, there's no limit to the amount of heat it can produce.
Yeah.
As a historian, didn't Hirohito kind of get this, but his weakness just wasn't his strength wasn't strong enough to stop it?
Exactly. No, I think that's very, very accurate. I mean, in fact, he's constantly being assured as Japan begins making its forays into China starting in 1931 and then in 1937 as well as they're going to continue. Initially it's, this is going to be a nothing war. We'll kind of be in and out. Of course, that's going to continue on and on and on. It's just going to chew up a lot of Japan's soldiers. And so they're going to, the military is then going to come back to before the outbreak of the larger Pacific War with the United States and sort of ask for his blessing for the attack on Pearl Harbor. And this is where he's really going to he's going to stall, and it's really going to, for about a month, he's going to kind of go back and forth. And at this point, he's beginning to not be distrustful. He's beginning to be distrustful of his military. Their claims for a quick war in China didn't pan out. He's being told that, yes, we can defeat the Americans, but he's also hearing other voices saying, look, once this war begins, we're not 100% sure where it's going to go or how it's going to end.
They clashed with the Soviets, and the Soviets kicked the living hell out of them.
Yeah,
in Manchuria.
And there's this huge pressure, though, hanging over him. And this is where it falls back on. He's a pretty passive, weak figure at this point. And so he's ultimately going to cave and give his blessing. But not before stalling. He's going to certainly stall for the better part of about a month. But in the end, he's going to cave. And then throughout the war, initially Japan is going to have sort of a great run of things for the first, 6 or so months up until Midway, really even the Coral Sea. And then, of course, the war is going to begin its sort of downward grind for Japan. And that's when he's going to start, the frustration's going to build. It will then go into a much higher drive for them once the American bombings of the Japanese homeland began and in earnest with the fire raids in the spring of 1945.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest.
Your day moves fast. Your news should too. That's why there's a new and improved Wish TV app, bringing you more local news, breaking alerts, live streaming, weather forecast, radar, and Indiana sports, all in one place. Customize your news feed to see the stories that matter most to you and get the information you need when you need it. Download the new and improved Wish TV app today on iOS or Android and take News 8 with you everywhere.
This award-winning historian James M. Scott. We are discussing his book, Empire of Ashes, Truman, Hirohito, and the Descent into Total War. You led me right into my next question. I mean, the course of the Pacific Wars is pretty well known. Let's get to 1945.
Yeah.
So in February of 45, February 19th, the United States invades Iwo Jima.
Correct. Yeah.
On April 1st, 1945, the United States, along with my great uncle, George, invades Okinawa. This 1945, the pivotal year, obviously, it's the year of the end of the war. What is the state of the two countries, of the two governments? We can't really say two leaders because Truman's not president yet, but what's the state of the two countries as the United States gets closer and closer?
Well, it's important to note that really the fight on the battlefield is going to change during that last year of the war, and that Japan is going to, they recognize that we no longer have the ability to sort of outright defeat the United States. And so in America, of course, is demanding unconditional surrender at this point. And unconditional surrender, I'm sure your audience knows, but that's effectively you just lay down everything. We get to remake your society. We're going to rip out the roots of militarism or Nazism. We're going to change your laws, governance, constitution, everything. We get the total right to remake your society. Japanese military leaders did not want that. They very much wanted conditions. They wanted to be able to keep the emperor if they wanted to. They did not want to be occupied. They wanted to be able to not have allied forces trying their troops as war criminals. They had a whole range of things, but the forefront of it all really was to be able to make sure that they could keep the emperor. And so what they realize is that they've got to change their battlefield tactics in order to try to stave off this unconditional surrender threat. And so what they do is you see it change where we're no longer going to defend the beachheads. We're no longer going to have bonsai charges. What we're going to now do, we're going to dig in and entrench, and we're going to make this an attritional war of extreme violence for the Americans. We're going to make them fight for every single step of ground that they take, with the hope that if we can make it bloody and horrible enough, the American public will turn against this concept of unconditional surrender, and we will be able to negotiate a better position at the bargaining table. And you really start to see that. It begins in earnest with Peleliu in the fall of 1944, but you see it in Manila, the Philippines capital, in February and March of 1945, which is just the only real urban fight of the Pacific War, but it is an ugly, horrific slog. Incidentally, I wrote a book about that. If your audience is interested, Rampage, MacArthur, Yamashita, and the Battle of Manila. But also Okinawa follows that. Iwo Jima follows that. Iwo Jima is horrific. And I've been to Iwo Jima. You go up the top of Mount Suribachi.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And you could stand up there. You can see where the flag pole was put in there. And from the top of Suribachi, you can see the whole battlefield, 8 square miles. It's tiny. You can walk from the airstrip to the top of Suribachi in an hour and a half. And yet that tiny battlefield took 36 days, to the tune of almost 50,000 casualties. We had more casualties than the Japanese, 27,000 American casualties, 7,000 KIA, 20,000 wounded. The Japanese had 20,000 KIA. The battlefield was so awful that newspaper accounts talked about reporters walking down there and seeing intestines on the beaches. It was just that violent of a battle. And then Okinawa was going to follow that in April. Much, much larger, equally as violent. I've been to Okinawa. I've crawled through the tunnels. I've been to the top of Hacksaw Ridge. I've been to the top of Kakashi Ridge. That battlefield, the heart of that battlefield is only about 20 square miles, and just how horrific that was. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, civilians. America had 25,000 combat fatigue cases alone. Okay. All of this pales in comparison to what Kyushu and Honshu are going to be like. And it's important.
And
those are the two Japanese home island objectives that America is aiming for next. Kyushu is going to be the fall of 1945. Honshu, the main island, is going to be the spring of 1946. And of course, June of 1945, Truman greenlights the Kyushu invasion. So it is on. From June 18th onward, the military is actively planning the invasion of Kyushu at that point. And what people forget is that Truman was a veteran of World War I. He had been an artilleryman in World War I. He had seen the horror of World War I. I spent a lot of time reading all of his personal letters during that time period. And fortunately, he was just a prolific writer, and we have, as historians, we have a gift of his text. But you can see when he's going off to war in France, he's a young man in his 30s. He's excited. He's going to prove himself. You see that all in his letters. He gets there. He sees the horror of it all. And he finally writes a letter back to Bess Wallace, who's going to eventually be his wife. And he says, look, if I make it through this, I will be happy for the rest of my life to just follow a mule down a farm row in Missouri after this. He's done. He's seen it. And so when he's learning about the horror of Okinawa, he's hearing about what Kyushu is going to be like. He's seeing it through the lens of his personal experience, and it's going to be horrific. The
And
Japanese.
he becomes president when, excuse me, as Okinawa is still happening.
Absolutely, yeah. 12 days into the Battle of Okinawa. Okinawa is going to go on 82 days. Okinawa is going to end about the time he's making the decision to invade Kyushu. And so, and at this point, letters are coming into the War Department. Editorials are heading on op-ed pages about, if Okinawa is costing us this many casualties, imagine what the main islands are going to be like. I mean, he's seeing and hearing all these voices about how bad things are going to get. And of course, into this mix comes Trinity. And that, of course, is the successful tests of the first ever nuclear weapon in July of 1945. And with that comes the promise that maybe, just maybe, there's another way to end this war.
You ever find it somewhat, when you do this research, somewhat ironic that one of the ultimate totalitarian militarist societies is counting the free democracy to express itself in a way that precludes the invasion of Japan?
You just blotted out on me for a second. Repeat that last bit. I'm sorry. You just froze
There's a
on
lot of syllables there, Mr. Scott. Let me see what I can do here. Do you find it, as a historian,
Yeah.
find it somewhat ironic that a militaristic totalitarian society like Japan has, as part of its strategy for the end of the war, to rely on the free expression that is inherent in a democracy to save its people from being slaughtered?
That's an awesome. I've actually never considered that. That's a really awesome point. Thank you for that. And I'll tell you, one of the other great things about it too is Japanese leaders actually early on felt that our biggest flaw was our form of governance. That they counted on a democracy and to prevent American leaders from fighting a costly, very expensive, and bloody war on the opposite side of the public and opposite side of the Pacific, and that based on that, the American public would never go along with it long enough, and that they would eventually be able to sue for peace and keep what they wanted, which is largely Indonesia and some of the other islands there. So, I mean, Japan throughout the war has a tendency to fall back on its ideas for our governance and society, how it's going to help them out. That's a good point, though. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the one about the media on that. Yeah.
Let me say this, see if I can ask this the right way. We talk a lot, and your book details it, and other books have. Your book details it in a very readable way. A lot of discussion about what Iwo Jima and Okinawa meant to the United States. I had to say taught them, but the impression these two battles made. Excuse me.
Yeah, no, they're
What
huge.
impression did these battles make on the Japanese government and the emperor?
Well, and in fact, actually, that's a really great point as well, because for the Americans, it was a window into, oh my God, if this is what taking an 8 square mile island's going to be like. Whew, I mean, imagine when you're spanning that out over an island that's 50 times the size of that, or 100 times the size of that. For the Japanese, they took a more positive lesson from it. They said, well, look at Okinawa. Look at what just 3 Japanese divisions did to the Americans. 3 Japanese divisions were able to slow the Americans for 82 days. Were able to inflict these incredible casualties on the Americans, spark this robust public debate inside the American press. And we did that all with, a handful of guys compared to what the Americans had. So imagine what we can do when we get them on Kyushu or we get them on Honshu. And of course, what Japan was doing at this point is they knew where we were going next. And, if you look at a map of the Pacific, you can see how the Americans are kind of climbing up towards the home islands. It's just like going up a ladder. So they started rushing troops to Kyushu. They knew that would be the likely next place we were going to land. So the Americans can see this build up, and through the through our code breaking of Japanese military communications, we were seeing that more and more divisions were landing there. But more importantly, too, Japanese had begun to enlist civilians into this sort of great national military here. And so they were, counting on civilians that they were training to use spears. And this is everybody from like junior high school kids all the way up to grandparents. Like, you guys are now going to be citizen soldiers. You guys are now going to have to help defend us at the beaches and drive off the Americans. And so 75 million Japanese people sort of unite on this idea. And so it was they were pulling all of these resources in together. What was left of its Air Force was becoming kamikaze fighters. There was this whole sort of push towards almost a national suicide to try and stop the Americans during these invasions. So,
That's a good point in the sense that not only was the home army, for lack of a better term, numbered in the millions, they were pulling troops from China,
yeah,
various other places, but the entire Japanese people were either motivated or being whipped into motivation or scared,
yeah,
especially scared. The stories that the Japanese would tell, which is interesting because all they really had to do was take the stories that were true about the Japanese and then change it from Japan to America,
yeah.
because what the Japanese did in the Pacific has never gotten the treatment it deserves.
I agree. Yeah.
Does it make sense for the Americans at the time to look for any alternative, in the sense of, if the bomb hadn't been detonated successfully in July 16th, 1945, were there any other fallbacks other than invasion to try to avoid the slaughter?
It's a good point. A good question. Yeah. Each service initially kind of had its own view of how best to end the war. And for example, the Air Force, which at that point is still part of the Army, it's the Army Air Forces. They had begun the city burning campaign under Curtis LeMay, which was extraordinarily successful. By the time of the atomic bombs, they burned out 64 urban centers in Japan. About 170 square miles of Japanese urban areas have been completely burned out. Tokyo, give you an example, 56 square miles of Tokyo were burned out in a half dozen different raids. Put that in perspective, Manhattan Island's only 21 square miles. They've literally burned out almost 3 times the size of Manhattan Island. They had, by June of 1945, burned out the hearts of 6 of Japan's major industrial cities. They'd moved down to secondary-sized cities, burned those out, and moved down to tertiary-sized cities. They were literally burning cities of a population of about 35,000. Curtis LeMay was asked by Hap Arnold when he thought the war would be over, and he said, well, from our perspective, it should be over by October 1st, because by October 1st, we'll be out of cities. So the Air Force was adamant that they could continue to just burn down Japan's cities. That alone, however, did not necessarily guarantee Japan's surrender. The Navy had been extremely effective through the submarine war against the Japanese home islands, and that doesn't get the attention that it warrants, I think, but the Navy did a fantastic job with its submarine blockade, so much so that Japanese society was literally being strangled. I mean, you just could not get enough resources in. It is a materially bankrupt nation. They're self-sufficient in only a handful of industries like sulfur and fish oil, which, guess what? You don't need a whole lot of that in society. You need things like
They
rice.
imported rice, isn't that
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah, they did. Japan had to import rice. I mean, they needed to catch enough seafood. They had to go pretty far, all the way to Alaska, Panama Canal. So, I mean, Japanese society is really kind of collapsing at this point. They don't have enough fuel. Kamikazes are a direct result of the fact that they don't have enough fuel to train pilots. Their battleships don't have enough fuel. I mean, the Battle of Okinawa, they literally send the Yamato all the way down there on a one-way mission because they don't have enough fuel to send it down and back. So they literally send it down there with the hopes that it'll beach itself and become basically an anti-aircraft position there. The average Japanese person spending almost 6 hours a day figuring out where their next meal's coming from. Daily caloric intake has dropped to 1,600 calories. New mothers can't produce milk to nurse their newborns because they're simply so malnourished. Infant mortality rates are climbing. Children are developing rickets. I mean, all of this is the breaking down of Japanese society, and it's all a direct result of the blockade. And so the Navy says, well, we'll just continue to blockade. And of course, you got George Marshall on the other side saying, guys, I've heard all about blockades. I've heard all about air power. But guess what? In Europe, we still had to go ashore in France and make it happen. So
Right.
the Army is very much advocating that. Now, the reality of what's going on is you have to pull that lens even further back than just Japan. And you have to say, okay, yeah, all right, we could blockade and continue to firebomb. We could drag this thing out. But people are dying, not just in Japan, they're dying all over Asia at this point. And that becomes a bigger consideration because you've got famine is developing in places like Vietnam. You've got disease. I mean, China is going to lose 20 million people. So much so that sort of modern scholars, guys like Rich Frank, he's a great friend of mine and an amazing Pacific.
Oh, podcast guest.
Yeah, he's a great historian. And we kind of joke and say Rich is kind of the dean of all the Pacific War nerds that are out there, all 6 of us, because there's not a whole lot of us that focus on it. But Rich is he's the smartest of the bunch. And yeah, Rich conservatively estimates that about 250,000 people were dying every month in the last year of the war in Asia. Now, my dear friend John Parshall thinks that number is even higher. He puts it up closer, in some cases, up to about 500,000. But regardless, the numbers are high. People, every month this war goes on, hundreds of thousands of more people die. So if you're going to continue the blockade, you're going to continue the firebombing, you're going to drag this thing out month after month after month, potentially for another 18 months or so. So at that point, your numbers of deaths and casualties are going to just go through the roof. So really, there's an urgency to end the war, and so all of these things are debated, and they're all debated. Blockade, continue the air war, all of them are debated in June of 1945. When Truman ultimately makes that decision that we're going to go ahead and greenlight the invasion. And at that meeting, it's a pretty pivotal meeting because what you see at that meeting is that the Navy and the Air Force all ultimately come around to Marshall's perspective and say, you know what? We do need an invasion. And they all get on board with the concept of the invasion at that meeting. So they kind of come in all over the place. They leave united. And so at that point, we're really racing towards that. Now, of course, what's going to happen is as we continue getting more and more of this intelligence coming in about what's going on in Kyushu, there's going to be a reawakening of like, oh my God, Kyushu, which we thought we were going to have 3 American troops coming ashore for every 1 Japanese troop. You're going to start to see that goes from 3-1 to 2-1 to 1-1. And at that point, by August, there's going to be a reconsideration of, hey, maybe Kyushu, maybe that's not the right place after all or whatnot. Coincidentally, that meeting was scheduled for August 6, 1945. Meeting never takes place.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is author historian James M. Scott. We're discussing his magnificent book, Empire of Ashes, Truman, Hirohito, and the Descent into Total War. Maybe we can elevate the mood here for just a second. Do you have a particular Hoosier leader and or legend you admire most?
Hoosier, let me see. Oh, now you totally stumped me on that. I'm trying to think, who do I know from Indiana? Refresh my memory. Well,
I mean, there's Larry Bird, but we don't have to. It doesn't have to be modern. It can be forever.
I was thinking of World War II. I'm trying to think of who from Indiana.
There's a giant one from World War II from Indiana. Went to high school right up the street from my house.
You've totally stumped me on this.
Raymond Spruance.
Oh yeah, Spruance. Yeah, of course, Navy.
Spruance went to Shortridge shortly before Richard Lugar went to Shortridge, and shortly, I think, before Kurt Vonnegut went to Shortridge.
Absolutely.
Anyway,
Spruance actually one of my favorites. He gets dogged for the Marianas turkey shoot, which ultimately foreshadows exactly what happens to Bull Halsey in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. So Spruance.
Senator Lugar spent years trying to get Spruance's 5th star. And I don't really know why it didn't happen, because that would have evened the Navy and the Army between the two. And I think Spruance deserves it. Go ahead.
Dude, he deserved it more than Halsey did. No doubt about it.
That's what we think here.
No. I mean, and I'll tell you this, Spruance gets dogged after the Marianas turkey shoot because he doesn't chase the Navy. Because remember, he views his job as protecting the troops ashore. And he gets dogged big time for that. And exactly what Spruance did is what Halsey doesn't do soon thereafter in Leyte. And it's an absolute disaster. So, I mean, Halsey just showed Spruance was right.
And I always thought Spruance's attitude towards Halsey getting his 5th star was certainly very Midwest. He deserves it. He's my friend. I'm not jealous.
He's classy about it. About it. Yeah, very true.
We get into the summer of 45. So Iwo Jima is conquered. Okinawa is finally conquered. There's airstrips everywhere, which is what allows all this firebombing to a certain extent. You mentioned that the United States is starting to maybe reevaluate in the late summer. The A-bomb hasn't been successfully tested yet, but all the top American military leaders, they know about it, most if not all. So that's part of their decision making. At any point, did the leaders of Japan go through the same sort of self-examination in the sense of, we're going to lose this war. We've already lost millions or tens of millions. Why inflict this slaughter on our civilian population?
Yeah. I mean, really the only figure who initially does that is Hirohito, and he starts it even earlier. He starts it back actually in early 45 when he summons sort of a group of, it's called the Jushin, and it's a group of senior political leaders, and a lot of them are retired prime ministers, and so he starts polling them individually. And of course, to give you a sense of just how the dire the politics are in Japan, he has to do it sort of secretly so that the army doesn't find out he's sort of taking the temperature of past leaders. So they do it under the guise of, well, we're just going to get everybody to kind of come in and offer up their New Year's good wishes to the emperor. And through this guise, he ultimately starts polling former Japanese military leaders about what they think the state of the war is. And so he is genuinely looking to take the pulse of what's going on. And the majority of them are all like, we should keep fighting, except one of them, Konoe, who says, you know what, it's going to be a disaster. So he starts kind of feeling out that early on. Now, by the summer of 1945, by June, the majority of Japan's major cities are gutted by fire at this point. And Hirohito then, and at this point, the army is trying to force Japan into a political requirement that they really were going to fight to the finish. And at this point, Hirohito, again, has to sort of intervene and say, you know what, we're tired of this. We got to hurry up and figure out another way out of this war. But what ultimately happens is, like so much in Japanese bureaucracy, it's slow. And so Hirohito sort of demands we got to start looking for alternatives out of this war other than a fight. And what that's eventually going to look like is trying to get the Russians to come in and mediate some sort of solution to this. But they're super slow in doing that. And of course, at this point, it's important to remind people that, the Russians and the Japanese have signed a neutrality agreement in 1941. It says, we're not going to go to war with each other. And if either side chooses not to re-up this, you agree for a year after refusing that signature that you won't invade. So what happens then is in April of 1945, Russia says, we're done with this neutrality agreement. And so they start foreshadowing the fact that Russia is going to come into the war. But in theory, they've got a year before they're technically supposed to be able to do that under the terms of the agreement. But you're depending on Joseph Stalin to sort of be the one that's going to honor that. But anyway, despite all that, the Japanese sort of reach out to the Russians, because who else are they going to reach out to and say, hey, is there any way we can get you guys to kind of help out? But what happens is the Russians don't want anything to do with them. They just say, you know what? We don't think now's not the time to come. They keep blowing off this concept of sending over a high-level envoy to talk to them. And of course, all this is taking place right around the time that Truman is going to go meet with Stalin and Churchill in the suburbs of Berlin at Potsdam. And so Japan could see the writing on the wall. The Russians are blowing us off. They've not signed the neutrality agreement. And then meanwhile, they're meeting in the burned out suburbs of the Germany's capital with the other Allied leaders, no doubt, to talk about carving up Japan and what the post-war is going to look like. And so it's too little, too late, effectively, is what happens.
President Truman is in Potsdam when he receives word that the Trinity test is successful. Take us through. So that's July 16th. He probably hears about July 17th or 18th or right there, so
right
middle
around
of
there.
July.
Yeah, they send off a coded message to him right away that says it's happened, but it's going to take a couple days before they're literally going to fly a report over from Trinity that's going to have Leslie Groves all over it in it that maps out exactly what it was like. But yes, he's starting to get word pretty much within hours.
And it's not like he's flying back on the overnight Delta flight. So it takes him a while. He sails back, as I recall, or takes the ship back. So discuss, please, for the Leaders and Legends podcast audience, the American process of what to do next from July 20th. Because the thing that's so interesting to me in a lot of ways, it's 16 days, 17 days between the test and the fact that the bomb is going to be dropped on Hiroshima. How does that transform the United States attitude?
Big time. So Truman goes over to Potsdam, and his top goal is to get Russia to hurry up and come into the war. And the reason he wants Russia to come into the war is because Russian forces can tie down Japanese troops in China, specifically up in Manchuria. Because what the U.S. doesn't want is the Japanese to rush those troops over to Kyushu. They've been watching this huge buildup happening on Kyushu. They recognize that Japan is sort of building this bulkhead against the Americans coming in. And so they need the Russians to tie down those forces to prevent that. So much so, we've been secretly sending the Russians tons and tons of aid. I mean, we've been sending them over 100 ships. We've been sending them everything from underwear to cans of tuna fish. I mean, we're doing everything we can to help provision the Russians to fight the Japanese there in order to tie them down. That is Truman's number one goal, he says, when he shows up in Potsdam. Then, boom, the bomb works. He suddenly realizes we have an alternative way out of here. Meanwhile, he has been hearing nonstop from Churchill about how bad the Russians are in Europe. The Iron Curtain is coming down. Russia is trying to take over and sort of have puppet governments in places like Poland. So suddenly, now if he's got a way to win without Russia, the concerns become, well, what about Russia's interest in Japan? And of course, Russia has huge interest in Japan. They want Hokkaido and things like that. Suddenly, Truman goes, wait a second, maybe we don't need the Russians in Japan after all. And Marshall says to him at that point, well, it's too late. They're going to come into the war regardless whether you want them to or not. That's just how the Russians are. It's going to happen. We just need to hurry up and end the war effectively. And so at that point, then Marshall also says, oh, and by the way, if you're going to drop a bomb of this magnitude on the Japanese, history is going to shun you forever unless you honorably warn them and give them an option to get out. And that's been something that's been debated in Washington for the last couple of months, which is what should a warning to Japan look like? And of course, that ultimate warning is going to be called the Potsdam Declaration, but it's going to be the work of a lot of very talented people in the War Department, and the State Department, and the Navy who are going to all get together and say, okay, how are we going to warn the Japanese? And they ultimately come up with sort of this carrot and stick approach, which is the carrot is if you surrender, we won't wipe you out as a population. We will eventually welcome you back into the community of nations. We will help with the rebuilding. And if you don't do it, the stick side is total and utter destruction. And they don't make mention of an atomic bomb, but they make it very clear you're going to be facing hellacious destruction, which Japanese have already been facing through the firebombing campaigns too. So that's kind of what ultimately comes out of Potsdam, which is the idea that we don't necessarily need the Russians, but we do have to warn the Japanese of what's coming.
And as we get, because I want to ask you, to me, the fascinating time period is the Americans between the successful test and the decision to use the A-bomb. And I want to contrast that in a few minutes with what I think is another great time period, which is the Japanese between the impact of the A-bomb and what they eventually decide to do. But I must also say, shout out to the USS Indianapolis.
Yeah.
And James O'Donnell, who lived in my neighborhood, who was a survivor of the Indianapolis. I think there's one more. There's one left.
Is there one left? Wow.
There's one left. Anyway, so there were a lot of debates. Have the Japanese come over for a demonstration, drop a bunch of leaflets, have all these other sorts of things that weren't going to kill tens and tens of thousands of people. So the question is, why did that option win out?
Exactly. And that's how, in all the post-war debate, people always say, well, why didn't the United States do a test? Why didn't we just go drop one?
Gar Alperowitz and
I know.
Barton Bernstein, all those. It's awful. Sorry.
Exactly. And the reality is all that stuff was debated. Every bit of it. We talked about, you're going to talk up the Japanese. All right, we got this bomb. We're going to do this test. What happens if it's a dud? You've lost all your shock value. And you got to remember, the atomic bomb is a political weapon. People forget that. Yes, it's a highly destructive bomb, but man, look at what we did at Tokyo with one raid. 16 square miles, 105,000 people killed. Atomic bomb isn't going to be any greater necessarily than that. So its value is in its ability to shock the Japanese political leaders into surrendering. And so if you then tell the Japanese, we've got this great new bomb, and you do a test and it doesn't go off, all that's gone. They're going to be like, yeah, whatever. Next time you tell them, we got this new weapon. Yeah, well, we saw it happen the last time. Or we're going to drop it on this one little Japanese island or area here. What if they put all the American prisoners of war there? And then you ultimately end up dropping it and killing there. So all these different ideas about how it should be tested or demonstrated and things like that were actually evaluated before the bomb was actually dropped. But ultimately, the realization once again came back down to the value of the bomb, the importance of the bomb was as a political shock to the Japanese system. And in order to do that, you had to have it hit a city without any concrete warning. You could say look, utter destruction, but you can't tell them exactly what you're about to do in case it doesn't go off, but you have to shock their system. And so that's why they ultimately settled on the decision that they did to use it there on Hiroshima. And so I'm with you. All those people over the years, they brought up all these sort of red herrings, but the reality is these were incredibly smart, moral thinkers during World War II. They understood the gravity of this weapon. They debated the moral consequences of it. They examined it from many different options before ultimately settling on the path that they chose.
And every alternative they considered up until August 45 was meant to spare the Japanese. So the idea that they were just a bunch of bloodthirsty militants, military minds, couldn't be further from the truth, because what they were looking for wasn't what the alternative wasn't, we're going to drop an A bomb every damn week until we decide we don't want to anymore. The alternative was, we got to figure out a way to end this war without killing more people. And the Japanese simply never gave them that chance.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll tell you, and that's why, and people forget that that second bomb is the most vital one. I mean, everybody talks about Hiroshima, Hiroshima gets all the attention today and whatnot, but it was the second bomb that was really the critical one. And in fact,
Because it proved that we could make them as many as we needed.
Exactly. And that goes back to Leslie Groves and to the Manhattan Project guys saying, you know what, the second bomb was originally going to be dropped on August 11th. And they said, you know what, we need to move heaven and earth. We need this to be a 1-2 punch. Get this thing assembled, get it on Japan as quickly as you can, because that's the only way that we're going to send a message to the Japanese that we have a stockpile of these things. And of course, the Japanese, one of the arguments of the militarists was, no way the Americans have more than one of these things. We already survived it. The regime's still intact. Boom, you get hit 75 hours later. Hey, they may never have to invade. They may just sit offshore, drop these things every 3 days till we're all gone. So it was a ruse, but it worked. And Nagasaki was the linchpin.
It's a great point. You're right. It is often forgotten.
Yeah.
You mentioned the political impact, or the political sort of point of the A bombs towards Japan. What was the political point of the atomic bombs towards the Soviet Union?
Yeah, and that gets, and this goes back to what we were just talking about with, the different sort of post-war historians. They've tried to really elevate the role of the Soviets, and this was really the bomb wasn't about ending the war with Japan. The bomb was really about sending a message to the Russians. And I'm sorry, I just don't buy that. I really don't. Nothing in the historical record points to that. And I've extensively looked at it all. And what you're seeing is this is historical revisionism framed through the 1960s and the Cold War by diplomatic historians. So
in Vietnam, and the
and
questioning of the use of American power.
exactly. And these guys are looking at it from the lens of politics and not the military. And you have to look at the atomic bomb through the lens of the military thinkers at that point, which is, and their view is, how do we end this war? The Russians, like I said, there's nothing in there that points to that this was a weapon that was going to be used. And if you look at the historians that have tried to make those arguments, it's by splicing out little nuggets of text here and there and trying to assemble them in a pretty disingenuous way to make that point. And also, it also gets to the whole point of the Japanese, what was more important, the atomic bomb or the Russians? Without a doubt, it's the atomic bomb. The Japanese, as we touched on earlier, they knew the Russians were coming into the war, didn't sign the neutrality agreement, refused all their efforts to mediate and to even have an envoy come over. They knew that the Russians were not going to be on their side with this. So it's really the atomic bombs does it add pressure to the Japanese, the entry by the Russians? Of course. Is it a deciding factor? No.
Plus, Stalin, because of his spies, knew a hell of a lot more about the A bomb and its production. And
totally.
Then
and that's a great point too. I mean, it's not like it was.
They didn't come as a surprise to him. He knew it was coming.
Exactly.
They were working on their own.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it really, exactly. I just thought that's such a disingenuous argument, I think, in the post-war era.
The first atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima on which date?
August 6th.
And the bomb is dropped on the Nagasaki on which date?
August 9th.
The Japanese surrender on.
Where Hirohito makes
they communicate
they start that process literally right soon thereafter, but it's officially they won't surrender until the 15th when Hirohito's speech is played to the whole nation. But it is
15th of August was the date I was looking for sure.
Yeah, the negotiation with the Americans will begin very soon thereafter. Because what will happen is on August 9th, they're actually meeting that night, and that August 9th rolls into August 10th, and they're deadlocked. The big six are deadlocked. Three want peace, three want to keep the war going. And at that point, really what in theory, what should have happened is anytime there's a deadlock, the Japanese government should disband and a new government is formed. But they don't do that. I think they recognize that it's too perilous of a moment and that they can't waste that time. So what happens is Admiral Suzuki, who's the prime minister, turns to Hirohito about 2 o'clock in the morning on the 10th, and he says, "What do we do? We're deadlocked." And at that point, Hirohito says, "It's time we bear the unbearable. We got to surrender." And he really breaks that deadlock and pushes Japan down that road. Now, what's going to happen in the next few days is the hardliners inside there are going to demand demand conditions, even though the peaceniks, the peace advocates are going to say, you know what, we just need to accept it. But Japan's initially going to try fishing. They're going to say, we need some options. The Americans are going to say, we're not having any of that unconditional surrender. And eventually they're going to pretty much wind up effectively there. The only thing they're going to push, the Japanese really push for, is that they want the emperor to be preserved. And Truman and Jimmy Burns, who's the Secretary of State, wisely basically write back and say, you know what? We will kick that can down the road. We will let the Supreme Allied Commander, in this case Douglas MacArthur, he can decide that. But right now we need you to surrender. And with that, the Japanese are like, we're done. And so
the Japanese, I love we need to preserve the emperor so that we can assassinate him if he does something we don't like.
So exactly. And that was one of the arguments, that a lot of the Americans that didn't want the emperor, they wanted him as a war criminal, things like that, were, hey, he was a tool of the militarists. We can't let him hang around. We've got to wipe out the whole role of the emperor in Japanese society because of that.
I meant to ask you this a few minutes earlier, so forgive me, I didn't. But as a historian, take just a minute and try to take us back to 1941, 2, 3, 4, 5, the Pacific War, and the American attitude towards Japan, because it's so completely unfathomable now. We don't have that attitude towards really anybody or any country, but the fervor, the hate, the desire for vengeance. What did Roosevelt say? Will win the Americans in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I think that's close. During his speech on Pearl Harbor. Talk to us about the American people and their desire to, we want to end the war, but you're going to be taught a lesson.
That applied to the Germans as well, too. I mean, we were very adamant that we were going to wipe out. And Roosevelt was really clear that the average German and Japanese citizen had to understand their role in this war, that they had to be made to pay for it as well. But for Japan, it was particularly vociferous. And by that, I mean, Pearl Harbor became this slogan. I mean, that was just that was the sucker punch and the black eye that would carry on. And then, of course, throughout the war, you start learning more and more about the atrocities, the Bataan Death March and things like that. And then the Pentagon they wisely played those things out in the press to sort of keep the American motivation going amongst the public, because there was a great fear that once Germany surrendered, that the American public would say, you know what, we're kind of tired of war. Just let Japan surrender, give them whatever conditions they want, and do that. So they had to really kind of keep the angst levels high, because the war against Japan was always further behind than the war against Germany, because we didn't even begin the air war against Japan until late 1944, really in earnest in 45. And by then, Germany, of course, has been bombed for years. So there was always this fear that the war in Japan was going to take longer. Pacific is vast. It's much bigger.
Islands no one's ever heard of.
Islands, atolls, all of that, just going to take longer and a harder fight to get all the way back, to be able to get to Japan and then be able to do the damage to Japan to get them to the point of surrender.
In this 4 or 5 day period between August 15th and the bombing of Nagasaki, you've alluded to this a few times, were there assassination attempts, plots against the emperor, and look, we're going to take over the government and we're going to fight to the last man, and that's just the way it is?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, peace is never secure until he literally goes on the radio that morning or that midday of the 15th. Even though Hirohito orders it, and this has always been a problem with Japan. It's not necessarily the senior military leaders. It's that fanatical junior officer corps. And so what happens is, even after you've got the senior leaders have agreed, okay, we're going to surrender, you have an attempted coup led by some of the junior officers. And what they're going to do is they're going to go and they're going to kill the head of the Imperial Guard. They're going to go to the Imperial Palace, which is this 531-acre compound in the heart of Tokyo. and they're going to try to capture the emperor to protect him. And what happens is when they go there, they realize they end up kidnapping a team from NHK, which is their equivalent of like a CBS or an NBC. And from them, they learn that Hirohito has recorded a surrender speech and that speech is on a record somewhere on that palace grounds. And so what that does is that sets off literally an all-night scavenger hunt across the imperial grounds to try to find the emperor and his senior aides and find that record. And of course, all of this is taking place, and you have to remember Tokyo is a wasteland at this point, right? There are no lights on out there. It's all in darkness. Half the city's been burned out completely. And finally, the army senior leaders realize what's happened, and they rush over to the imperial palace. And instead of capturing these conspirators, they actually just let them go. And these guys then go over to NHK and try to cut the cable and stop the broadcast from taking place. And so, I mean, it's really, it
Final
keeps,
tap.
yeah, it is. It's like, it just keeps going on. It's like, finally, they're thwarted yet again, and they ultimately commit suicide, and the record is able to be played. But it's very, very touch and go that night. Had Hirohito been caught, had the record been found, I mean, history could have played out very, very differently. And so it's very precarious how it happens. I will tell you, one of my favorite places to go, and I lead tours of Japan with take tourists over there, and we do battlefield tours and stuff like that. And NHK has a museum in downtown Tokyo. And it's like, imagine if PBS had a museum and you would go in there, and much of the museum's going to have puppets of like Big Bird and all that kind of stuff. You go up to like the third or fourth floor of this museum, and all the way in the far back, they have the record on display that Hirohito made that night. And this thing weighs just a few ounces, but it's the most important artifact of World War II, I think, because it's on that record that 4.5 minutes are his voice bringing it into the war.
How would you grade Harry Truman's performance from April 12th, let's just say, to August 15th? We don't necessarily. September 2nd is the ceremony on Missouri, isn't that right? How would you grade Harry Truman?
Oh, I think he gets an A. I mean, I think he comes in for a guy that everybody expected to fail. He ends up pretty much pulling it all off, and I think he does it. And he does it because he knows what he doesn't know, and he's terrified by what he doesn't know. And so he comes in there. In fact, he's so terrified about what he doesn't know, he keeps blabbering about how he doesn't know what he doesn't know, to the point that Jimmy Burns finally has to pull him aside and smack him around a little bit and say, "Hey, you got to act presidential. Yes, you're scared. We know. We're scared. We're all scared. But the American public has to see strength out of you. And so you can't make comments like he does to the press where he's like, oh, I can't believe I'm in this awful situation."
Exactly.
Because the American public needs reassurance. This is a pivotal moment. Yes, we're a dominant power at this point, but still a lot can happen. And so Truman very wisely keeps critical people in play. Guys like Henry Stimson, Leslie Groves. He brings Jimmy Burns, who was very close with FDR, brings him even tighter into the fold. He also spends every night. Fortunately, his wife hates Washington. Bess just goes, I'm going back to Missouri. She leaves him home alone, frees him up every evening to study, because Truman was very tight with his wife and daughter. He would have spent that time with his family. He just studies. It's just like cramming for the law bar or for your medical boards. He just studies all summer, and he wisely seeks out counsel. He goes even for people who weren't day in and day out government, guys like Harry Hopkins, who had sort of managed U.S. negotiations with Russia. He goes and meets with Hopkins. What can you tell me about dealing with Stalin? What can you tell me about dealing with Churchill? He wisely recognizes the learning curve he faces and does everything he can to overcome it. And I think, quite frankly, he's successful, man. The war ends. It ends quickly. It ends far faster than anybody realizes or thinks is possible.
What was the general, there's is it Paul Fussell?
Yeah.
Thank God for the atomic bomb, or, that was and you read the letters, as I mentioned, my great uncle George was sitting there on a ship, like getting ready for the invasion. And as I got older and got out of the Army and had a chance to talk to him on a little bit, not equal terms, but closer, not a 9-year-old kid.
Yeah.
I asked him, I said, what were your thoughts when you heard all this in August of 45? And I remember him looking at me and just saying, he was in 8 major invasions in the Central Pacific. And I remember him saying, I never would have survived. We'd all died. if we'd had to invade Japan. So the American soldier, the sailor, the airman, the Marine, what were their reactions to the atomic bomb? And do you think that sort of, Truman never looked back. He said the most difficult decision he ever made was to intervene in Korea. It wasn't the use of the atomic bomb. How did the American reaction help steel Truman for, I did the right thing?
I think you're absolutely right. And in fact, I quote a letter in the epilogue of the book from that I found in the Truman archives and there are many of those types of letters in there from a soldier who said the same thing. I was involved in multiple campaigns. There's no way I would have made it. I'm alive today. And he wrote it, I think in the 70s, like I've had these 3 decades since because of that decision that you made. The American public was wholeheartedly on board. 85% of the American public supported the use of the atomic bomb. There's a great comment from an editorial in the Boston Globe that said, 2 bombs cost $2 billion. What a deal. And effectively, that captured the sort of national euphoria that people felt that the war was over and the bloodletting was done. Because I think people were girding themselves for what kind of horror awaited us on the beaches of Kyushu and Honshu. And so there was this sense of national sigh of relief and whatnot. And I'll tell you, watch it when word breaks in Washington that the surrender negotiations are going back and forth between Truman and between Washington and Tokyo. Lafayette Park fills up day after day. People are out there. I mean, there's just this huge national sense that this trauma is about to end. And when you go back and you go through the Washington Post or the Evening Star and you look at the photographs and you read the accounts, I mean, there's just celebratory gunfires going off in downtown Washington. I mean, it's crazy to think of that kind of stuff, but yet here it was. I mean, this was a nation exhausted of war, tired of sending its young men and women, 16 million people in uniform. I mean, just tired of that. And we're now enlisting another 150,000 troops every single month in preparation for this. I mean, and yet then it's over. That's the miracle of the ending for so many people.
And the reaction of the Japanese people?
They're stunned. And I think, quite frankly, and I've interviewed a number of people in Japan who survived, and I think there is a collective sense of, oh my God, we've been defeated. There is this national sense of just like trauma of being defeated. But at the same time, there's also a certain sense of relief that the war is over. And I've talked to twice this came up in 2 different interviews with Japanese folks who said they'll never forget turning the lights on that night for the first time because no longer were there blackout restrictions. And then very quickly, the fears that had been in place in Japanese people that the Americans were going to be brutal, they were going to be horrible during the occupation one, none of that manifested itself. In fact, the American occupation was a very benevolent occupation. You hear stories, Japanese people talk about what it was like to eat canned cheese and chocolate for the first time. That, all the fears that they had, and of course, those fears were legit. I mean, you see mass suicides on Saipan because Japanese citizens on Saipan were so told that the Americans were going to kill you that people jumped off of the cliffs.
With their kids, holding hands with their sons and daughters.
I lead tours to those cliffs. It's one of the most horrible places I visit because it's one of the most beautiful places on this planet, and yet so much horror took place there. Same thing happened on Tinian. And so there was a real, the Japanese people, I think, were bracing for that, and then ultimately were stunned it wasn't that. So, but yeah, it definitely, defeat is a hard pill to swallow for a soldier, for a civilian. The South. Yeah. I mean, I live in the heart of it. I'm in Charleston.
Weimar, Germany. Yeah.
People here will say it's just halftime. It's not even over.
The SEC can't even win the national championship anymore. That belongs to the Indiana Hoosiers. We have reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. Scott, are you ready?
I'm ready. Fire away.
What was your first job?
Like real job or like
real job?
I was actually
not mowing grass.
Okay. I was a public school teacher in Japan. That's my first real job.
Fluent in Japanese, obviously?
No, I taught in English. I was a junior high school teacher on the JET program in Japan. That's what sparked my whole interest in the Pacific War. It was 1997, 1998. I taught at a small rural school on the main island of Japan.
And you didn't have to be fluent in Japanese, even though you're teaching English?
No, I had a Japanese teacher in the classroom with me, and so that was that was the time that's what sparked my interest. That's my first visit to Hiroshima, Tokyo, Kyoto, all the places that I would subsequently go back to many, many times in the subsequent decades.
You've got me wanting to go on this tour. Second question: what was your first concert?
First concert. Wow. I think it was Tom Petty, actually. I think it was high school Tom Petty, as I recall.
Not bad.
Not
Another one
bad.
left us too soon.
Yeah.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Empire of Ashes. Truman,
This,
Hirohito, and a descent into total war. Come on.
and your other ones? Do what you got to do. Talk about your other books and where we can find them.
Yeah, no, I would suggest if you got to read the precursor to this, which is all about the firebombing. That is Black Snow, Curtis LeMay, The Firebombing of Tokyo and the Road to the Atomic Bomb. Also published by W.W. Norton. That came out in 2022. And of course, that naturally segues into Empire of Ashes. So I think if you're interested in the conversation we've had today, you would very much enjoy both of those books. Get them on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or wherever your local bookseller.
We're a capitalist podcast, so we want to help you sell books.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Next question. If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Man, I don't know. I will tell you, if I could go back to history, not necessarily for an event, but a period of history, I think it would be ancient Rome. I'm super fascinated by Roman history and that whole time period. Caesar crossing the Rubicon. I think I would go there.
It's so dispositive.
Yeah.
It's like so much of what we do and talk about or whatever now traces directly back to them.
It does. It does. It's the foundation of everything. I mean, if you look at Caesar's book on the Gallic Wars, I mean, when I was in grad school for military history, 2 different classes, I had to read that book. I mean, so much goes back to that time period.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Man, living today.
I put living today as I think you're my 370th podcast interview. And when I formulated these questions at the beginning, I thought, living today would make it so much easier because they don't have to choose between, Lincoln and Moses and, whomever. I don't think that's the case. I think it's actually made it more difficult.
I'd go, and I'm just going to say, I would much rather go hang out with Leslie Groves. I think that would be, per our conversation today, and I'll say why.
So there's nobody today you want to have dinner
There are
with?
plenty of people, but my head's in 1945 right now, and I will tell you, and I'm still chafing because I don't think Leslie Groves gets the attention that he deserves.
He does not.
Christopher Nolan made a movie about Oppenheimer, and there is no Oppenheimer without Leslie Groves. Leslie Groves is the guy that really does it all.
After he builds the Pentagon.
Yes, after and of course, the whole night before Trinity, what you don't see in the Oppenheimer film is the fact that Leslie Groves is having to walk around patting him on the back and assure him all night long, not only does Grove have to figure out how to build all the atomic cities, figure out all of that kind of stuff, he then has to shepherd his, nervous wreck scientist along the way. And I just think Groves, but you know what? He's not as sexy for a movie because he doesn't dabble in communism. He doesn't have all these sort of issues that often. I mean, who wants to really watch a movie about a really good engineer who's good at his job?
Did we ever figure out why Eisenhower just loathed Groves?
Oh, I think everybody kind of loathed, loathed him. I mean, that's the thing. Everybody, even the people that liked him out of respect more than as a person. I mean, he was I've read his letters to his children. I mean, his letter to his son, he designed it once disgustingly yours. He was a martinet. He was a tough guy, tough dad, tough leader. But
he eventually got portrayed by Paul Newman. There's not many people who can say that.
And Matt Damon. Come on now. Let's be honest. And Groves would have loved that because, he was not Jason Bourne. He was like 250, 300 pounds. He had a big ego. So he would have loved Matt Damon playing him. So.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, not starring Matt Damon, even though you're welcome to come on, sir, whenever you want. We are presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. We are also a federally certified veteran-owned small business, registered with the state of Indiana and the city of Indianapolis. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of Airman, Air Corps Captain P.E. McAllister. Our guest, James Scott, his book, Empire of Ashes, Truman, Hirohito, and the Descent into Total War. If you want to know what happened in those months that changed world history, this is the book to read. The research, of course, is impeccable, and the conversations and the letters that Mr. Scott brings up puts in his book really takes you to the spot where these meetings were happening. Thank you so much for your time for coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast.
Absolutely, Robert. Thanks so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.